Check out the Los Angeles suburb of Hidden Hills, a handful of Mediterranean and ranch-style mansions scattered amid rolling, lightly wooded hills 15 miles inland from Malibu. It boasts one of the highest incomes per capita of any community in California, and quite frankly, in the world. It's the kind of place where residents have live-in gardeners, private chefs, and 6-car garages are taken for granted. The community is home to fabulously successful business executives and professionals, as well as actors, celebrities, and reality television stars. It is also one of the nation's oldest gated communities, part of the vanguard of what's become a controversial national trend: self-segregation by income class. But today, communities like Hidden Hills aren't just simply for the rich and famous, but for everyday middle-class Americans as well, who don't quite find that the sleepy suburbs are secluded enough for them just yet. Way back in 2002, USA Today reported that approximately 40% of new builds in California were behind walls. And today, that number continues to rise. But pop over across the Atlantic and gated communities here are few and far between. Sure, you might find individual homes with gated access to their driveway, but even in the most exclusive zip codes of Switzerland, residents generally cringe at the very idea of an entire secluded community. So why do you find entire towns in the United States where thousands of residents pool their funds to have membership-only access to golf courses, swimming pools, and tennis courts, and privatize public services like roads, trash collection, landscaping, and hardscaping, but not here in Europe? Well, it's a fascinating story of culture, economics, and tax avoidance. So, let's take a look. Gated communities are residential areas with restricted access in which normally public spaces are privatized. They are security developments with designated perimeters, usually walls or fences, and controlled entrances that are intended to prevent penetration by non-residents. They include new developments in older areas retrofitted with gates and fences, and they're found in the inner cities to the suburbs, from the richest neighborhoods to the poorest. And their gates range from elaborate 2-story guardhouses staffed 24 hours a day to rollback wrought iron gates to simple electric arms. Guardhouses are usually built with one lane for guests and visitors and a second lane for residents who may open the gates with electronic card, a code, or a remote control device. Some communities with round-the-clock security require all cars to pass the guard, issuing identification stickers for residents' cars. Others use video cameras to record the license plate numbers and sometimes the faces of all who pass through. Entrances without guards have intercom systems, some with video monitors that residents may use to screen visitors. But the residents that we're discussing today are not multi-unit condominiums or apartment buildings that just happen to have a doorman or an intercom system, because gated communities are just quite frankly different. Their walls and fences preclude public access to streets, sidewalks, parks, beaches, rivers, trails, and playgrounds, all resources that, without gates or walls, would be open and shared by all citizens of a locality. Gated communities go against most of what is currently in vogue in progressive urbanist thought. But still, by the year 2009, almost 11 million people in the United States were reported to be living in gated communities. Today, that number is estimated at approximately 13 to 15 million, but it's hard to get a good estimate. So quite frankly, it's likely that this estimate is widely underreported. But what we do know for a fact is that HOAs are certainly growing in their popularity. We also know that people living in HOAs are on average more affluent and racially segregated than those living in similar non-HOA neighborhoods. We also know that in 2017, 61% of all new US homes and around 80% of homes in new subdivisions were part of a common interest neighborhood governed by a homeowners association. In absolute numbers, California and Florida are home to the most gated communities, with Texas coming in at a distant third. But even if you aren't from these parts of the United States, you might still be familiar with the super elite gated communities thanks to the pervasive and popular allure of their fortified walls.
Hey, what's up? I'm Kim Kardashian, and welcome to my crib.
Spaces where perks include writing arenas and performing arts centers. And the rich and famous seek out these extravagant homes with equally extravagant price tags for a number of reasons, be it their highly sought after locations, amenities, or limited number of estates. In short, they are exclusive, and they represent the 3 Ps of real estate: privacy, protection, and prestige. But truth be told, gated communities actually span the gamut of residential structures in the United States, all the way from regular everyday citizens to mega mansions and condominiums. So what is driving this broader process of residential fortification? And what does it mean for the life of our neighborhoods? Well, to tell this story, we need to go way back. The setting of boundaries is always a political act. Boundaries determine membership. Someone has to be inside and someone outside. Boundaries also create and delineate space to facilitate the activities and purposes of political, economic, and social life. And using physical space to create social space is a deep and long American tradition. The earliest American gated communities date back to the 1850s, and the communities that were created during the Gilded Age were often planned and designed to provide fresh air and respite from the hustle and bustle of urban life for the wealthy and elite of New York. Because, those city mansions were just too cramped, if you know what I mean. For example, Tuxedo Park in Orange County, New York was another monumental moment in gated community living, founded in the mid-1880s. It's actually where the tuxedo jacket was first introduced in America, and where Emily Post drew inspiration for manners she observed while living there. And it was where Wall Street titans, robber barons, and descendants of blue-blooded colonial families who lived there made the community synonymous with upper-class living in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. But gated communities as we know them today have been springing up around the country since the early 1980s. Most gated communities today are located in the Sun Belt region in the South and Southwest, where there's more land available for development. They're usually developed privately, and for this reason, it's difficult to determine the total number, like I mentioned before. And although they're often unincorporated, there are numerous incorporated gated cities in Southern California, namely Bradbury, Canyon Lake, Hidden Hills, Laguna Woods, and Rolling Hills. And millions of Americans have chosen to live in walled and fenced communal residential spaces that were previously integrated with the larger civic space. And what I find fascinating about some of these gated communities is that they've actually found a legal loophole that not only keeps their residents richer, but outside of the larger governmental jurisdiction. Let's go back and take a look at the community I led this video with, Hidden Hills, California, because there's a reason the rich and famous choose to live there. It's because of their taxes. In 1961, 10 years into its existence as a private enclave in California, Hidden Hills took a step forward that made it unusual, to say the least. Like other gated communities, it had a thriving, well-managed private homeowners association that oversaw many of its affairs. But Hidden Hills chose to incorporate itself as a full-fledged city, but left its gates and private homeowners association in place. Ever since, Hidden Hills has been a city with 2 governments, one private, one public. It's one of the handful of examples where there is an entire gated city in the United States. Odder still is the way in which the 2 governments have divided their powers. In Hidden Hills, the city government, the public entity, carries out building inspections, provides security, issues licenses, and sponsors some adult education programs, funding them all through property tax revenues. It also manages the local trash collection franchise. Meanwhile, the Hidden Hills Homeowners Association is very busy with other matters. In Hidden Hills, this private government controls the community's quintessentially public spaces and events. Its parks, its roads, its horse trails, and even its annual 4th of July parade. But there's one more oddity, perhaps the crowning one. In 1995, after 34 years of sharing a sleek wood and glass low-rise on Long Valley Road in the center of town, the two governments split up. Hidden Hills public government moved to a renovated slate-roofed garage on Spring Valley Road, just 25 feet inside one of the community's 3 gates. Then the homeowners association moved the gate. Today, the City Hall of Hidden Hills stands 75 feet outside of the town's own gates. There is a method to Hidden Hills' various madnesses. Consider first the advantage the town derives by publicly providing an array of easily privatized services. Residents can actually claim their property tax payments as deductions on their federal and state income tax returns. If these services were funded out of private homeowner dues, however, they wouldn't get the same deduction. All of this seems clear enough. But then might we ask, why is it then that Hidden Hills has placed most of its public functions, including its 4th of July parade, in the hands of its private government? Well, because if these things were furnished by the public government, paid out for with property taxes, they would legally have to remain open to all. They would have to be public because every American taxpayer would be contributing to their support. And that would be the antithesis to the very exclusive nature of this private community. There is only one public space, however, that Hidden Hills just quite frankly couldn't privatize. It couldn't put in the hands of its private government. And that's City Hall, the seat of its public government. An ineradicably public space where anyone from anywhere can legally demand to go. That's why it had to be moved outside of the city gates. If people got into town by simply just saying, hey, I need to go to City Hall, well then legally they'd have to let them in the walls, and yeah, that'd kind of defeat the purpose of the entire security, right? Curious as it is, Hidden Hills may be actually pointing the way to some of the more fundamental dilemmas and conflicts of the American future. Americans today are caught in an array of forces pushing at the grassroots level to redraw the boundary between public and private spaces. Gated communities are really just the most obvious example. And as someone who has studied extensively the political economics of residential properties, well, this isn't exactly surprising, to say the least. But it does bring to light some of the most basic questions a community can ask itself. Are the vital, commonplace acts of purchasing trash collection, parks, roads, and sewage services ones we undertake in our public or in our private roles? Do we perform them as citizens who have shouldered the broader public purposes of government, or as consumers who need to look out only for ourselves? Okay, now I would be entirely misleading if I said that Europe didn't have any gated communities, because of course they do. For example, in the United Kingdom, the most prestigious gated communities, or private estates, are generally seen as being those around the fringes of London and include large estates at St. George's Hill and Wentworth, both of which are in Surrey. And with amenities such as golf courses and tennis clubs and land ownership that is divided between homes with gardens belonging to homeowners and the estate roads and verges belonging to its residents association, yeah, it certainly beckons the same elite and prestigious connotations as well as land use planning that Hidden Hills employs in the United States. And even here in Germany, closed communities on guarded housing estates are popping up in Potsdam and Berlin, Frankfurt and Leipzig, complete with manicured grounds, electric barriers mounted 24/7 by sensors and guards. But comparing gated communities between Europe and the United States is, quite frankly, really difficult because they are, in fact, quite different from one another. Not just in how they look, but also in how they function legally. Not to mention the fact that there are significant differences between how gated communities look and function between Western and Eastern Europe. Gated communities are infinitely more popular in Eastern Europe. Now, this is an old study published in 2013, but in 2004 it was reported that Warsaw alone had 200 gated communities, whereas all of France had only 72 at the time. And there are legitimate reasons for why gated communities are just quite frankly more popular there, and it's something that somebody could probably write an entire dissertation on if they haven't already. The fall of the socialist regimes in Eastern European countries from 1989 and 1991 and the establishment of democracies resulted in a lot of changes concerning the city building process. Due to the extensive privatization that followed, public obligation and responsibility was transferred to private parties, which results in a weakened civil society as the border between state powers and private interest hardened. But in comparison to Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, gated communities are far more popular in the Mediterranean. In Spain and Portugal, you can find condominium and single-family gated communities. They only have little common infrastructure, normally a pool and a playground. Contrary to this type of housing in America, in Madrid, condominium-type gated communities are actually home to all socioeconomic classes. However, whether you're in Eastern or Western Europe, there are still huge differences in comparison to the American model of gated communities. Because in Europe, you really don't have homeowners associations that have anywhere close to the kind of dictatorial power and authority that they do in the United States. In most European communities, the collective residents are in charge of voting and making decisions. There's no board, no attorney, and certainly no bylaws that have the power to impose fines to ensure compliance or punish residents who violate noise policies, parking rules, or pet sizes. In Portugal, for example, the ownership of properties with shared elements such as buildings, amenities, or land is established through a kind of co-ownership system. But it's democratic. And in the Netherlands, while homeowners associations are a thing, they're mainly only implemented in apartment buildings or houses with shared roofs or parking to take care of communal parts of the building like halls, pipes, walls, stairs, etc. You essentially pay a fee to a community pool of money that's used for things like maintenance or insurance. And this is much more a function of utility than it is of control. In much of Europe, residential properties are often part of a bigger housing complex, and the number of individual property houses is limited. And so if you have a larger building, but you want each apartment or condo to be a single legal unit, you have the legal right as an owner, or even quite frankly as a candidate buyer, to not only view all of the HOA's financial statements, but also the full annual report on the state of the building so that you can perform your due diligence. So fundamentally, if we want to examine a homeowners association not as a social construct, but as a legal entity, HOAs in Europe do not exercise the same autonomy or even, quite frankly, the same authority as HOAs in the United States do. In the United States, HOAs often are recognized as private, nonprofit corporations under state law, and they're actually the fastest growing institution for local governance in the United States. Because the courts have viewed HOAs as business ventures, they have some autonomy from city and state oversight. As they're considered private corporations, HOAs are actually not subject to the protections of individual rights from government infringement related to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and due process. So all of that led me to the final kind of big question that I wanted to investigate. If HOAs and gated communities impose all of these fees and limitations on the residents, then why are people flocking to live there in the first place? Well, for starters, there's a financial incentive to do so. Beyond the tax savings cashed in by the residents of Hidden Hills, studies do support the notion that buying a home in an HOA is a solid investment. A recent study estimates that houses and HOAs in Maricopa County, Arizona, for example, are valued at 4% higher than comparable homes outside of HOAs. And data from the US Census Bureau's annual survey of construction indicates a growing disparity in mean sale price between HOA and non-HOA homes nationally, with HOA homes commanding a 15% premium in 2019. But in this area of dramatic demographic, economic, and social change, perhaps the biggest incentive for buying or building in an HOA or gated community is due to the growing fear about the future. Many feel vulnerable, unsure of their place and the stability of their neighborhoods in face of rapid change. And while this fear might certainly sound the loudest in the United States, I would wager that the United States certainly isn't alone in this phenomenon. Anytime we have migration, particularly migration from people from other countries, it tends to sort of fester and bubble up in a certain amount of xenophobia. And that happens really no matter where you are in the world. So while the phenomenon of walled cities and gated communities is a dramatic manifestation of a new fortress mentality growing in America, it still persists in other countries too. It just might look a little different. Gates, fences, and private security guards like exclusionary land use policies, development regulations, and an assortment of other planning tools are really just a means of control, used to restrict or limit access to residential, commercial, and public spaces. Now, proponents of gated communities, and to a lesser degree of cul-de-sacs, maintain that the reduction or exclusion of people who would only pass through, or more generally, all non-local people, makes any stranger much more recognizable in the closed local environment and thus reduces crime danger. But do such assumptions actually hold up with research? Well, maybe not. Some research suggests that since only a very small proportion of non-local people passing through the area are potential criminals, increased traffic should increase rather than decrease safety by having more people around whose presence could deter criminal behavior, or who could provide assistance during an incident. And other studies indicate that safety in gated communities may be actually more of an illusion than a reality, and that gated communities in suburban areas of the United States have no less crime than similar non-gated communities. So for my final question of this video for you, to the viewer, well, I actually kind of wanted to take a little bit more of a critical turn because while I was doing the research for this topic, there was something that was weighing pretty heavily on my mind. Not too long ago, there was an op-ed published in the New York Times that specifically blamed the gated communities for the shooting death of Trayvon Martin, as the columnist states that, quote, gated communities churn a vicious cycle by attracting like-minded residents who seek shelter from outsiders, and whose physical seclusion then worsens paranoid groupthink against outsiders. And there was another influential paper. One author noted that, quote, this kind of urban planning prizes exclusionary and self-contained spaces that limit opportunities for interaction between different classes, while worsening marginalization of the urban poor. And while this certainly might be more dramatic in the United States, I don't really think this is a uniquely American problem. And I find myself wondering, through all of this, are we simply just trading one form of segregation for another? We can't legally segregate by race, so instead we segregate by income. Instead of building communities, we build fortresses with membership-only access. So while I completely understand the need and want to protect an investment, what do you think can be done to, I guess, limit this exclusion, limit this otherness that ultimately could potentially lead to tragedy? Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a very heavy subject, but I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments section of this video. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from Type Ashton, hit that subscribe button. So, I'll see you next Sunday. Tschüss!